Hi everyone. So I chose to research different cultural parenting styles in the Western part of the world and the non-Western. Like for example, the United States and China. I focused on China, Korea, and Japan for my non-Western countries, and I focused on the United States and Canada for the Western countries. My thesis is essentially, while Western parenting has very different, the styles of parenting in the West are very different than those in, say, China, Korea, Japan, places like that. There's no evidence to suggest that one way is necessarily correct. And I think it's important to understand that different parenting styles do not mean that someone is necessarily wrong, or that what works for one country or one part of the world works for another. There's a set of shared goals among parents of all cultures, really. They are survival, health, and really the attainment of cultural values. So we want our children to understand our cultural values. So that would make sense why we parent very differently. There are so many things that impact parenting, right? I mean, religion, whether you live in a rural or a suburban area makes a big impact. How your parents parented you, and your peers, how they take and how they decide to raise their kids. That can impact us and make us want to raise our kids similarly, or maybe we want to go in the opposite direction because we don't like something that's going on. So before I get started, I would like to clear up one thing. So in the West, we tend to be more authoritative when parenting, which means there's a high level of warmth. We have democracy in our parent-child relationships. So for example, our children get a say in a lot of things, at least some children. And there is a high level of behavioral control. So we still seem to be very, we have good results with controlling our children still, in general. And non-Western countries tend to be more authoritarian versus authoritative, which is low level of warmth is shown, still a high level of control, but absolutely no democracy. So you don't see children in China getting a say in whether or not their parents move to a different area or something like that. It's really unheard of. In China, the parents are the head of everything. You don't question it, you respect them, and you're obedient. So something that's interesting is that in the West, we view shyness as almost like an obstacle, as something to overcome. If someone's shy, there's something wrong with that. We have to help them get used to being around people. We need to do something. It's a deficit almost. Whereas in China, it's much more complex. Shyness can be considered in terms of the individual, but also in a group setting. So for example, if a child in China does not tend to boast about their grades or their achievements, that can be considered shy. However, modesty is a big thing in the Chinese culture. It is taught that you are to be modest, and that is one of the principles of Confucianism. And so that makes a lot of sense. So that really impacts their culture. So as I said before, children in China are meant to be obedient. They are supposed to be righteous, wise, and benevolent. It is up to the parents, though, to ensure this happens. And the parents take on this responsibility, and they take it very seriously. They make a lot of sacrifices for their children. They do show that it's not that they don't show that they care. They do, absolutely. but in a much different way. It's not so much in the way of discussing their children's feelings about something as much as they will struggle and toil to ensure that their children have a good education and things of that nature. Fathers in China tend to be more distant and dominant, and that is very typical of the Chinese culture in general, because it's viewed that if you're really the more dominant, the elders are, you have to respect them, right? And it's absolutely not okay to question your father or anything of that nature. I guess in a sense, you could think of Chinese parenting almost like some people's grandparents, how they used to parent, right? I mean, my grandfather was, you didn't disrespect, you didn't say no, you didn't argue, and that was just what that was. Interestingly, some studies have shown that Chinese parents use more forms of physical punishment than those in the United States or Canada do. I don't know what to make of that. Interestingly, not much else has been said about it besides that they use it. I haven't found any research that tells whether or not it is necessarily, it leads to good outcomes or bad outcomes in specific terms to China. So, we can't really use Western research to make broad generalizations about non-Western countries. However, mainland China, in the mainland anyway, it's starting to get more westernized, right? And so they're not completely lax if we consider our parenting styles lax, but they're changing a bit over time, and that seems to be interesting, and I think that's something to watch. Children, though, in general, in China must control their emotions at all times. It's not okay or acceptable to be overly emotional and, throwing fits and everything else. So, you really need to be a bit more reserved. And that seems to be something throughout the Chinese culture. They take a lot of pride in being reserved, modest, very put together. So I learned a lot about whether or not Western research works for non-Western countries. So in the United States, authoritativeness is associated with really positive results. So it leads to better emotional stability and, higher achievement in areas like math and science. And so to us, that seems to be the ideal way to parent. However, in China, though they are more authoritarian, it seems to be almost irrelevant in a sense, because children there do equally as well, if not better, academically. This says something about whether or not we can use our research of what works for parenting in our culture and apply it to theirs. I just argue that we simply can't after reading the research. This goes back to the idea that our parenting styles might be completely different, and they might be similar in some ways, such as the high level of behavioral control. However, neither seem to be right nor wrong, because they're both getting good results. So that's something to look into. Children are considered to be in the lower ranks of the family in China. They're almost considered as property. That doesn't mean they're abused or anything like that. But they are dependent, submissive, obedient, and granting autonomy in China, unlike the United States, is almost considered a threat to the parental hierarchy, right? So because it's almost as if the parents are the rulers, and you don't want to give too much power to the children, because then they fear that they're going to, rebel or something of the such. In China, it's more common to share negative emotions such as anger and frustration. However, things like happiness, joy, excitement, and things of that nature are shared a lot less often, actually. And you don't see things like PDA. So there's not a lot of hand-holding, kissing, and things of that nature in the family, because it's simply just, I think it might go back to the idea of modesty, and I don't think they feel it's appropriate. So I think we have to look at our cultures in terms of things that deeply impact them. So, for example, the politics in the United States. So how we have a Congress, and and we have a democracy, or some refer to it more as a republic. And we have a say in what happens and everything like that. Whereas in China, it's a lot less, you have a lot less of a voice. And so I think it speaks to the idea that maybe they don't care as much, or they don't feel the need to, or at least the children don't, to have so much of a say. So I don't really know as if anything's being taken away from them by not being granted a great deal of autonomy by their parents. I don't think it's like it would be in the United States, because in the United States, we teach our children to be independent beings. We teach them to be self-assertive and things of that nature. Whereas in China, it's not considered to be a deficit if you're dependent. In fact, you're supposed to be dependent. So the final thing I want to mention is just the Confucianism. So when we look at Confucianism, we look at it and you can't look at the culture in China and the parenting styles without considering it. It deeply impacts China, Japan, and Korea. They place, in Confucianism, higher values are placed on the scholar. The farmer is considered less than. So, whereas in the United States, we do, at least I think some of us still believe at least a little bit, that someone can come from nothing and still have really great ideas and be something special. Look at FDR. He wasn't necessarily a scholar, and he did some pretty great things for the country. And it also, in Confucianism, they also place a very high, they place significance on family hierarchy. So that might be why in the parenting styles in China, it's more common for, the parent to be the head person of the house. They are in charge. You don't question it. It's not, you don't argue with them to get your way. It's just you accept it. And I also found it interesting how just academically between China and the United States, they place a very, very, very great deal of pressure on children to be academically, to do well academically. We have pressure in the United States too, but parents don't tend to put the same kind of pressure. So I think that possibly Confucianism plays into that too, as to why they really want their children to be scholars and do well. Interestingly, I read a statistic that said that those in China, Chinese Americans, so people who live here now, who have immigrated to the United States from China, have a much higher rate of graduating college. So that's really interesting, and having higher degrees after college. So for instance, they got their master's or their doctorate or something like that. So you can see how it definitely plays a big role in their lives. So I guess I just want to finish up by saying that I felt like this was a really important topic, because often we see people judge other styles or other ways of doing things in other cultures as being wrong, archaic, sick. I mean, you have some cultures where the children sleep in the bed with the parents until they're 8 or 9, and then you have some cultures where children are working vigorously at 14. And I think that we tend to compare those cultures with what's normal, or normal in terms of what happens anyway, in our culture. And I don't think that's correct. I don't think we can do that. I think that we have to see what the research says in their culture. I don't think we can take our research or our evidence and place it to their culture. And so I think this tells us a lot about the differences and how the cultures really drive those differences, and how neither is wrong. However, we both, we can kind of agree to disagree, I guess. We don't need to be authoritarian to have success. However, in China, it works really well. So that's it. Thank you.